to do so, that would be great.
Yes.
But in the meantime, we are really excited to host today's event. We had over 50 participants register for today's events, and I'm sure more will be joining as we get into the session. However, I do need to take a moment and recognize Pastor Allen, for organizing today's event on behalf of the board. We work real closely with Charles and his team at Empower One, and of course, you all know that he runs an adult care facility and does an excellent job in our community, just helping with the populations that we serve, as well as involved in so many other endeavors around the community. Charles, I'm still getting a host disabled screen participation.
All right.
So
I got you here.
So, we really appreciate Charles working to coordinate this effort today. And also, I would be remiss in not mentioning our very own Pastor Dolores Williams. You know her as our Director of Health Equity. She leads our efforts around health equity, inclusion, and diversity. A dynamic community leader, and you will be hearing from her towards the end of the session. So Charles, I think we're just going to work this out so that you flip the slides for me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, then. Recognizing folks that, you joined this webinar today training to hear from our distinguished keynote speaker. I'm not going to take a lot of your time, but I have the duty to introduce our keynote and community resource opportunity speaker. And my plan is to do that up front before we start rolling, so we can just kind of roll from speaker to speaker. So if you don't mind, Charles, could you just flip to the next slide? So we're going to talk a little bit about the learning objectives first. So, today you joined the call today, and we hope by the end of the day that you'll have some information and be able to identify the Black Americans that are most at risk for suicide. You'll be able to describe the paradoxical helping-seeking relationship that exists between Black Americans and the church, and then also have a better understanding of the unique opportunities within the Black church to address issues of suicide. To help us walk through that process, I'm going to start out by providing just some basic data. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of data that you're going to have, but I'm just going to skim over it so that we can really get to the speakers. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers first, and then I'll start in on the data. First, I'm going to introduce Miss Amy Priest. Amy Priest is a licensed independent social worker and licensed chemical dependency counselor 3. She possesses a master's degree in social work from Eastern Michigan University and a bachelor's in criminal justice from Tiffin University. Amy currently serves as our Director of Programs and Services for the Mental Health Recovery Services Board. She's also held the position of Manager of Support Services and Manager of Treatment Services at the board. Before joining the board in 2013, Amy had 13 years experience working with the Board of Developmental Disabilities, Arrowhead Behavioral, and Task of Northwest Ohio. Amy is a certified mental health champion she is a certified mental health first aid instructor, and in 2008, Amy was recognized as a local reentry champion through the Center of Hope Church, and was recently awarded the Social Worker of the Year Award for Region 1 through the National Association of Social Workers, Ohio chapter. Very proud of Amy and the work that she does in the community. And our keynote speaker is Dr. Kamesha Spates. She's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at Kent State University. Her areas of specialization include the intersection of race, class, and gender, the African American experience, criminology, and sociology. She recently completed a book entitled "What Don't Kill Us Makes Us Stronger: Black Women on Suicide," where she uses her interviews to uncover reasons for the racial suicide paradox. Her analysis offers a deeper understanding of the life-positive strategies that underlie Black women's resilience. Some of her other works can be found in Essence Magazine, the Key Issues of Crime and Punishment series, the Sociology Compass Journal, Sex Roles, and the Journal of Pan-African Studies. She is currently working on projects related to examining the role of the Black church in suicide prevention, postvention, and mental health awareness, Northeast Ohio's Black community's readiness to address rising suicide rates, mental health and suicide awareness in the Kenyan context, and a Black parent's guide to talking with their children about suicide. She also trains organizations and laypersons to raise awareness about the topic of suicide using racially conscious framework. Thank you, Dr. Spates, for joining us today. We really look forward to hearing from you this morning. So, like I promised, I promised to go through some numbers just to kind of set the stage today. And what you have in front of you is little snippets from our most recent Lucas County Health Assessment that was literally released last week. I think it was on the 6th. So this is the most up-to-date numbers that we have. And now I'm not going to go through every single thing on this slide, but what I'd like you to focus is on the bottom right-hand portion of the graph. For those of you who may not be aware with the term ACEs, it stands for Adverse Child Experiences. And what we know about ACEs is that these are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. You know, experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, having family members die by suicide or attempt suicide. You know, those are just some of them. There's many more. This slide actually represents those adults in Lucas County that self-identified as having experienced four or more adverse childhood experiences. And why this is important is that science has actually linked the number of ACEs one experiences to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance use in adulthood. So we wanted to use this slide as to set the stage for other slides to come. So as you can see, there is a disproportionality of percentage of adults in our community that are that experience four or more ACEs. White individuals at 12%, African Americans at 18%, and Latinos at 27%. Next slide, please. So how does that number play out? This is just a cutout of one of the slides that were in the study. And by the way, when I'm done with the presentation, I will cut a link out of the presentation and drop it in the chat box for everybody, so you'll have access to where to go find the study for yourselves. But what we see in this slide is a progression of from 2007, 2011, 14, 17, and 20 of the adults in Lucas County who identify as African American and limited in some way because of their physical, mental, or emotional problems. And as you can see, that number is fairly stable across the last 13 years. You know, having a high of 56% of respondents and down to 45%. Compared to the overall Lucas County number of 37%. And another one, the second item that we wanted to identify is adults that considered attempting suicide in the past. And we can see that that number is highly volatile as well for African Americans, 3%, 5%, 2%, and 17, and 9%. Now, one of the things I think I also need to just reference is, the health department, the health assessment does a subset of for minority participants in their study. So these numbers can be highly volatile because of the lower response rates for African American and Latinos. So just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that. Nonetheless, we can see that African Americans in Lucas County consider attempting suicide in the past year at a higher rate than overall Lucas County. Next slide, please. So what this slide is basically it's a duplicate of the adult slide, but this is for children. And these numbers were actually from 2019 and represent ACEs for children, 3 or more ACEs. You remember the adults were 4 or more, this is 3 or more. And unfortunately, the health assessment does not break this number out by race like it did for adults. So I wasn't able to share that information with you. But we can see here that as a youth ages, their experience, adverse childhood experience also increases. So you look at the 13 or younger, 17%, 14 to 16, 28, and 17 to and older, 35%. I think the other thing that's interesting about this slide is that females are substantially more impacted by or experience adverse childhood experiences at a higher rate than males. And I think that number will play out in the numbers that we see in our completed suicides as well. So if we could show to the next slide, please. So this also is a replication of the adult slide regarding seriously considered and attempted. Charles, there you go. Thank you, sir. And so it's just presented a little differently. So you can see across the top of the slide, Lucas County, white 2019. So this is actually information just shown different ways. So you have grades 6 through 12 on the first half of the slide to the left, and then you have grades 9 through 12 on the right side of this slide. And so you can see that in almost every instance, with very limited exception, African Americans and Latinos experience higher rates of considering suicide, attempted suicide, and days feeling sad or hopeless. And in some of these instances, it is substantially more, percentage compared to Lucas County regular. So that's something that I'm sure Dr. Spates will be discussing. And the next slide, please, is just the link that I will show you. And of course, you notice that I haven't provided you any information on completed suicides yet. And Charles, please, to the next slide. And so this is a slide that we have received information through the Ohio Department of Health. And this is essentially 20 years worth of data, and 2019 data isn't completed yet. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom right corner of this slide. The reddish color is the Black and African American line, and the greenish color is the Hispanic line. And as you can see, starting in about 2014, well, actually 2012, the numbers for African American suicides, completed suicides, increased steadily until a small dip in 17, and then it jumps back up in 18 and 19. While the numbers are relatively, the numbers that are reported are relatively small, it still is cause for concern in our communities, given the information that I just shared with you related to the ACEs and contemplations of suicide and actual attempts for both adults and children. And so leading into Dr. Spates' comments, just wanted to provide you this information, and the next slide itself is, it's a little choppy, but essentially that is the data that feeds the slide that I gave you. So I thought you might like to see this. And you know, one thing in particular that I have a concern about in relation to the numbers that we see is the number that is in the top right corner. The number of African Americans completed suicide, 0 to 17. You look at 17, 18, and 19, and we don't have any recorded African American deaths for children, for individuals under the age of 17. Honestly, I'll just be truthful with you. I'm not sure I believe that. And I don't know what the issue might be with that. You know, the only information we have directly is from the Ohio Department of Health. And I know that Dr. Spates is going to talk a little bit about data and the numbers, and that's why I really wanted to point it out, because I think that there's a long way to go in our communities, locally, state, and federally, to track numbers that are more accurate in relation to race and cause of death. You know, just so that we can create better understanding of what the true scope of the issues are and create strategies around that. So with that, what I'll do is thank you for your time. That concludes my comments, and I will turn it over to Dr. Kamesha Spates.
Thank you, Scott. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen if, oh, okay. Charles, it looks like it's showing me that it's disabled for me to share my screen. Let's try again. Okay. Charles, are you there?
Yes, it should be.
Okay, there it goes.
Okay.
1 second here. Okay, there we go. Now it's working. Okay. There we go. Perfect. Can you all see my screen? Okay. Can you see the screen okay? Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. And thank you, Scott, for the wonderful introduction and for really kind of setting up the rest of our time today for me to kind of delve into some of these topics in a bit more detail. Before I do that, though, I definitely want to take a moment to acknowledge the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board of Lucas County. I think this may be my second or third event with the county, with the Mental Health and Recovery Service Board of Lucas County, and I've really been enjoying building this relationship and continuing to work with you all on health disparities related topics, and specifically suicide related and mental health related. So again, thank you for having me, Dolores, Pastor Dolores Williams. Thank you so much for, again, inviting me. And then also Pastor Charles Allen, I do appreciate your time and bringing us all together today. And so again, thank you, Scott, for kind of setting things up. I have a couple of things that we're going to talk about today. And Scott really set the stage for that. And so he's already talked about the learning outcomes. And so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this. The only thing I will say about these 3 points that are currently on the slides is that it's really my hope that you can walk away with a pretty general understanding of who's at risk. I have an hour with you today, so I really thought and prayed long and hard about what to include and what not to include. So my hope today is really to set the foundation for the next workshop that will come, that I think Dolores will talk about later today, but also to give you an idea of kind of some specific areas in which you can begin thinking about in your own faith-based organizations. And so moving forward, I always like to start by getting everybody on the same page and not making any assumptions about who knows what as it relates to this topic. And so I want to start by defining the actual concept of suicide. Every time I go into the community and I do awareness workshops, people are like, okay, so what is suicide? Does this classify as suicide, or does this classify as suicide? And I'm like, okay, not quite. But nonetheless, let's just start with a basic definition. The first is death from injury, poisoning, or suffocation, where there is evidence that a self-inflicted act led to the person's death. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but the key word here is intent, self-inflicted, and that's kind of what we look at when we classify something as an act of suicide. So now that we have that, kind of out, I like to start by also giving you a little bit of context for what brought me to this particular topic. I have to admit, in my discipline, there just wasn't, initially when I started 15 years ago now, I think, there wasn't a whole lot of Black scholars looking at suicide in the Black community. It was really seen as one of those things that, it wasn't really happening, so why look at something that's not really occurring? Initially, I started out wanting to dig into stigma around mental illness, and very quickly, my research projects began to shape more and more into conversations around suicide and the stigma around that topic as well. So just to start, I want to give you a little context for who I am. And this will be important in just a moment, trust me. But so I'm not just showing pictures of my family and loved ones just to bore you all. But this little lady here on the screen is my dear sweet grandmother, and my uncle is the gentleman on the screen. So they actually raised me from the time I was 3 years old up until, high school, or I guess college. And so I will say that both my parents suffer from mental illness. And so eventually I ended up in the care of my grandmother and my uncle, who co-parented and raised me up to be a wonderful young woman, at least I think so. And so one thing I want to tell you about my grandmother, she was born in 1927 in the state of Georgia. She really got a chance to see firsthand direct implications of Jim Crow. And many of the other issues that Black folks were dealing with, especially during that time in the South. And so she moved north. Mentally, that impacted her a great deal. She died just last year, but up into her death, there were still a number of race-related issues that she was just unable to talk about. In her time, she's witnessed lynchings and the impact of that. And so as you can imagine, her raising me was really centered around understanding, one, the importance of education, but also the importance of knowing your history and understanding your history and where you come from. So that was a really big deal for me growing up. So she, of course, raised me. I was a member of the Black church, continue to be a member of the Black church. I grew up in a Baptist Black church. And so there were conversations throughout my upbringing around mental health in the Black church. Some of them we'll talk about a little later, but nonetheless, as we think about context and what we bring to the conversation of suicide, I'm a sociologist, so I do have to admit that there's a really important piece, and that is understanding your role and understanding your perceptions around certain social issues. And in this case, we're talking mental health and suicide. And so this is just an image of a congregation. Nobody I know in particular, but I just like the picture. But moving forward, this is my graduate school. So I went on to my grandmother. Like I said, she had an 8th grade education. My uncle finished with his GED. And so I was the first in college, first one in the family to go on and receive a bachelor's degree. And of course, all the way up to the PhD level. But nonetheless, I bring this up because when we think about conversations around suicide, at least for me, I'm always asking myself about the issue of positionality. In other words, I am a Black woman. I am an individual who grew up in the church, but I do have to continue to ask myself, in terms of my upbringing, how does that impact the way I look at suicide from a variety of different ways? This is also additional picture. That's me, myself, my daughter, the little one in the back, and my husband. So I'm a wife and a mother. And then I'm also, like I mentioned before, all of this brings me to the topic of suicide. So I'm a sociologist. I've been studying health disparities work for a long time, specifically as it impacts the African-American community. And so this is an image of me in Kenya last summer, where I've been asked to come over. My team and we went over to look at suicide and mental health awareness in the Kenyan context, because this is also a really critical topic for them at this time. And so I'm happy to answer any additional questions about that later in the presentation. But nonetheless, what I want you to get from this is, having grown up with 2 parents, both parents suffering from mental illness. My grandmother, frankly, was traumatized by much of what she saw growing up in Georgia in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. This all really kind of gave me a sense of compassion around the topic of suicide, as well as a deep cultural understanding of kind of some of the perceptions that we have and where they stem from. So moving forward, I've asked Pastor Allen to post a polling question. So here's a time to do that. And so I'd like to get a sense for who's on the webinar today, demographically speaking. And so you'll see the polling question pop up here in just a second. I'll give you a moment to complete that. So please answer the following question. Which of the following best describes your current role in the church? I realize, having grown up in the church and still being a member myself, that oftentimes we occupy multiple roles. So I would just ask you to list the dominant role, your most dominant role. Where do you spend the majority of your time? Doing what? So if you can go ahead and answer the question, that would be wonderful. So Charles, I don't know if it'll show once everybody's responded to the question. Is there anything that I need to do on my end? Oh, I guess I probably need to respond, right? That's probably why it's up there. Okay.
Yeah, and both questions are actually showing.
Oh, they are showing. Okay. Yes. Where are they showing?
All I do, I can see the response.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So just answer the first one for now. Okay. So they have to answer both questions in order to move forward. Okay. That is, okay. So I'm just going to select something because I want to continue to go forward. All right. So are we able to see the results?
We're at 19 of 23 individuals responding right now.
Okay, perfect. So I'll give you just another minute to do that. And so again, as we think about context, which is what I started out with, I'm just going to ask you to now begin thinking about your personal upbringing, your own personal experiences, and how that is shaping your current views or perceptions of suicide in the Black community. So again, thinking about those sorts of things, the context, I really feel like regardless of what social issue we're talking about, we all bring our very own unique perspectives, but those perspectives are certainly shaped by a number of other points and experiences in our lives. I'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. The other thing I want to note while we're waiting on the last folks to respond is that the presentation slides, I don't know if you've already sent those out or not, Charles, but I've given Charles the permission, Pastor Charles, to share the slides.
Yes.
So you don't worry about getting everything down at this time.
Yeah, that's also in the chat section. So you can download that to your computer and take notes, or print it out and take notes as you go. We're at 22 of the 23. If you want me to give you the answers or end the polling.
That's pretty close. I mean, that's yeah.
All right. So we'll
And
end
just
the polling.
Just the first poll question would be okay now, and we can revisit that second one once we get to that point, if that's
All
fine.
right. The first poll question is the 1 administrator, 4 clergy that's on with us right now, 5 in leadership, 3 teachers, 6 members, 22 others, and 1 don't know.
Okay. All right. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of who's on the call today. Oh, perfect. Thank you for showing that. Yes, that's very helpful. So this is just take a snapshot of this for the participants that are on the call, because one of the things that I really, really enjoy and value about working with the Black Church is this really is an opportunity to do things more holistically. There are folks serving multiple roles and in different ways. And I think that that's the important piece when it comes to addressing any sort of social issue, is going into environments where there are different pieces of the puzzle operating, but you can kind of bring everybody together to serve in that one for the purposes of the goal that you're setting. All right, so I am trying to go to the next slide. Let's see here. Okay. All right, there we go. So for your views on suicide, let's continue to think about that for just a moment. There are really 3 points that I want to highlight to help you think about how you may perceive suicide. What I found in doing this work for some time is that we kind of have to start with us as individuals, the you as an individual, before we can begin to do effective outreach and awareness work. And so I just asked you to think about these 3 points: history, biography, and social structure. So what do I mean by that? History, again, your group history, and that would be being whether you're African-American, Caribbean-American, whatever your ethnic distinction might be, but thinking about your group history currently in the United States, as well as your individual history. And so these bring forth questions such as when and where you were born. Like I mentioned before, my grandmother was born in the South, born in the 1920s. That dramatically impacted the way she perceived mental illnesses, even though she had multiple children that were born with mental illnesses. And so in addition to that, your biography, what are your lived experiences? What are some things, irrespective of suicide, what are some things that you may have encountered in your lifetime that has impacted the way that you might see this particular topic? And then also social structure. Sociologists are really big on that. We define this as the invisible factor that guide or constrain our behaviors, opportunities, and access. So that this would be race, class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth, sexual identity. And so looking at the ways in which your personal self, who you are as an individual, thinking about the ways in which that frames the way you view suicide, and perhaps how you might respond to an individual that's in crisis, is incredibly important to thinking about the work, or kind of as a precursor to the work that you're looking to do or looking to learn more about. I really wanted to share, as Scott mentioned in my introduction, I've been collecting data, working alongside members of the Black community for the entire time I've been a graduate student, post-grad, faculty, so on and so forth. And so this is actually one of the quotes from from the book that I published not too long ago, where I interviewed a Black woman from Louisiana. She was 60 years old, and I'll never forget her comment around the topic of suicide. And she actually said, spiritually, we're taught that suicide is a sin. This is what stays in your head because you were told that You were told that you're forgiven for everything but self-murder, which is suicide. So I think that this is one of the things that we hold on to, that if you take your own life, you're doomed. So I'll let you sit with that for just a minute. I've been talking about context thus far. I've been talking about who you are and your personal experiences and how that may frame how you see the issue of suicide or suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And I really want, for me, growing up in the Black church, this was absolutely kind of driven home as really, really critical to how, we viewed suicide. And I'll never forget, I was interviewing another woman for the book project, and she said to me, I actually am suicidal. And she said, the only thing that stopped me from taking my life is I couldn't figure out logistically how to repent before I took my last breath. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. That again, thinking about how we frame suicide. And so this is now the opportunity for a breakout session. I don't know how many participants we have, but Charles, I'll let you figure out the logistics of who goes where and how many. But there are 2 points that I really want you to talk about in these breakout rooms with respect to those who adhere to your faith perspective, because I do realize not everybody on the call may be Black and Christian. But nonetheless, there are 2 questions, and I want you to discuss both. What are the dominant views with regards to suicide and its spiritual consequences? And then the other is, what are commonly held opinions of people of faith who attempt or die by suicide? So when you get into the respective groups, I want you to chat about these 2 questions. And if you can if one of you can volunteer and say, hey, I'll share, I don't mind, kind of summing up what we talked about quickly, that would be great. So kind of assign that role to someone and then be prepared to discuss these 2 separate questions in your breakout groups. So I think Charles will kind of give you an idea of where to go next.
Yeah, so I'm giving everybody a assigned room, and you guys can discuss that amongst yourselves.
Can we do 4 or 5 groups, Charles? I think we have 20 people. That might include us, though. I don't know.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, all right. So maybe 3 or 4 groups, if possible. I don't want them too large.
All right. I think Avis may have stepped away from her computer or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
right, and you said I can hop back and forth. I won't say very much in these rooms, but I'd like to make sure there's no confusion going on.
All right, you want me to put you in one?
Well, how will I be able to get out?
I think I can move you.
Okay, okay.
Because you're in room 2 right now. So if you want to pop in there.
Okay. And you can bring me out in about a minute because I'm going to give
Okay.
them 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Amy, you're more than welcome to do the same if you like.
Yeah, I thought we said on Friday that we weren't going to join the breakout room, so I just ignored it.
Yeah.
I follow the rules, Charles.
That's good.
I'll just stay where I am. It's fine.
I don't want to move her too fast because then she might be in the middle of a sentence.
Oh, yeah. We've had a pretty good turnout attendance-wise.
Yeah. I mean, out of 50, I was thinking like, people registered and they forget this pops up on their calendar. They just don't, at the moment it sounded good to them.
Yeah. I think that happens a lot with free trainings, especially.
Right.
They're short, so you sign up and.
I thought I hit randomly assign and it asked me how many rooms, and then it made me assign everybody. So that's what was taking so long. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no clue, so.
I should probably mute myself if I want to hum.
I muted. You're good. You're providing me background music.
Yeah, it was not the intent. So you have children, Amy?
I have one daughter. She's 5 years old.
Awesome.
So she's at the babysitter. We pulled her out of school because she's not in kindergarten yet, but she was doing preschool.
Oh, okay.
Out of school in the fall because school was so uncertain at that time. But I've already re-enrolled her. She's going to go back after the holidays.
Okay, awesome.
What about you?
Everybody is grown and gone except for one. I have a senior.
Oh.
That's still at home. And so she was always virtual through high school. We had her at Emmanuel up until high school, and then in high school she went to Ohio Virtual Academy.
Oh, okay.
So she's been virtual the whole time. And then we had so I have 7 biological and a bonus and 2 bonus children. So yeah, so it's 9 altogether.
Fun holiday time.
Yeah, unless it's COVID, then you can't gather like that, you know. But
I'm one of
yeah.
7, so I can relate to that.
Yeah. And then we have like 10 grandkids, so it's
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the youngest of 7, so my daughter is by far the youngest in my family. My nieces and nephews are almost all adults or close to it anyways. So she's the fun one to have around the holidays, but with COVID, I don't know what we're gonna do. Then I have a 4-legged daughter who's the mouthiest. So we're just gonna pray that she continues to sleep at my feet while I have to talk.
yes.
I told my family at Thanksgiving, I'm like, the problem is we don't live someplace tropical, because if we lived like in Florida, we could just have the holidays outside where it's safer.
Right.
So someone needs to buy some property someplace warm.
Yes. Yeah, that would be nice.
I have a sister in Hawaii, but I don't think it would be safe for all of us to travel.
Oh, yeah, that would be. But Hawaii is nice, though, I hear. You know, I've never been, so it's like it's one of my bucket list places, I guess.
Oh, well, if you ever make it, I'll connect you with my sister and brother-in-law.
Awesome.
They're retired military, and they're not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be great. Maybe we'll see how COVID looks in 2022.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got to get better.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close these out and bring everybody back. All breakout sessions will close in 56. So it's on the countdown.
Oh. So I'm going to need to share my screen again. So I'm going to do that now.
Okay.
That went well, Charles. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right. So everybody should be coming back here in a second, right? Okay, so give me the thumbs up, Pastor Allen, if everybody's back. Is everybody back, or are we still moving folks back?
Everybody's back.
Awesome. Okay, wonderful. I have to tell you all, so Pastor Allen was kind of allowing me to jump, between the breakout rooms, silently jump in between the breakout rooms. And I heard some really amazing conversation. I'm really excited about this. I encourage you to continue conversing about this topic in your own faith-based communities. It is, I would say, by far one of the more helpful ways to begin doing this work. And so I know we ran over time a little bit with this, but I think that the conversation was incredibly fruitful. And so I didn't want to cut them short. So if I could just get a few of you to share, kind of a summation of what you talked about for the first question, and then I'll get a few people to do that for the second question. So feel free to unmute. I think you have that capability. And we can go from there. So in terms of what are the dominant views with regards to suicide and its spiritual consequences, what were some of the conversations that happened around that question?
Well, what we talked about in our group is, again, it was taught that suicide was a sin. If you take your own life, you were going to hell, and there was no, there was no other way. And, and again, and it was passed down from generation to generation, from great grandmothers to grandmothers. And that was a belief. And again, we all kind of talked about, that being the narrative as we were growing up. And then, but we also talked about just that sitting in your spirit, how as you grow and you learn, and people that you love and that that love, love God and love the Lord, and mental illness, how does that just not sitting in your spirit as truth and wrestling with that concept of it being an unforgivable sin, So you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just saying, thank you for sharing that. Very well said. And one of the things for me that comes up when I hear that, and even as I do this work and I hear we have these sorts of conversations quite often, I just think about, imagine the amount of guilt and shame for the individual that is struggling with suicidal thoughts, or that has lost a family member to suicide. So just imagine that. But that's absolutely correct. I've been hearing that time and time again in the work that I'm doing. So thank you for sharing that. I think that, let's go on to the second question. What are some commonly held opinions of people of the faith who attempt or die by suicide? What are some commonly held opinions about that?
Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, was someone else talking?
Nope, floor's yours.
Thanks, Doris.
Okay. So I work with youth, and as a youth leader, and our whole group had talked about, none of the churches talk about suicide. And as a youth leader, I actually was given, I was teaching one Sunday, and I talked about suicide. I was a suicidal teen, and talked to the kids. And then afterwards, I talked to the pastor about doing some other things, and they're like, "Oh, you're not allowed to talk about suicide at church." And he said, "You're going to give them the idea of suicide as an option." And I said, "They're already thinking about it. That's really a myth." And they really, silenced me in that space. But I had already spoke to the kids there, so I was able to, if they did, feel suicidal, they would be able to reach out, and I could actually talk to their parents about it, that it's not given the idea, but they're already thinking about it. So in the church, our whole group, no one talked about suicide. And then I had one boy that I took to the Children's Resource Center, and the one thing that stopped him was he knew I was Christian. He went to church. And he said, "Will I go to hell?" And I said, "Honey, I don't know. I can't answer that." And that was essentially what kept him alive. And he's still alive, and he's 18 today. And that was when he was 14. So that God, in the back of his mind, but now he knows that it's going to be a thought, but what to do with it. So we just did a lot of transformational thinking in that space of what to do with it, because they are thinking about it.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that story. That was incredibly powerful and an important reminder for us all, because as I was jumping in and out of these breakout rooms, one of the things that I consistently heard in response to this question is, well, people aren't talking about it. I don't know if it ever happened. I mean, people have died, there were speculations, but we don't really know exactly what happened around the individual's death. So just the kind of the deafening silence that can occur, particularly in faith-based communities around this topic, just essentially nothing being said. Like, you can hear crickets, and people are thinking about it, people are struggling, people are dealing with certain things, but the conversations aren't being had. And I would even push that a bit further, having been doing this work for a long time and having talked with a number of Black community members. This is the case even within Black families, right? It's highly stigmatized. And so I recall doing some work with a family where they actually had lost an individual to suicide, but none of the folks in the younger generation knew it. It had happened a couple of generations ago, but folks had just been told, you know, hey, listen, let that stay in the past. We don't necessarily need to talk about that. So irregardless of what happened, you know, just act as if you don't know. So the younger generations were struggling in this family, were struggling with this sort of thing, never knowing that this had been an issue previously in their family. And one of the things that the research tells us is that if there's been other family members, and particularly parents and things like that, that have experienced, that have died by suicide or experienced issues around that can certainly impact their children and the generations to come. So I know that everybody didn't get a chance to share. You're welcome to kind of put some of your thoughts in the chat box. The beautiful thing about these virtual webinars is, you know, this sort of thing, these things live here now permanently, so we can go back and really read through and reflect even more. So I am grateful that you all were willing to share. You hopped right in. I learned a lot, and we'll continue these conversations if we get more time. All right, so continuing on, I'll just sum up my research literally over the past 15 years. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I wanted the conversations to really be at the heart of what we did today. But nonetheless, things that came up in your conversations, you'll see reflected here. One, that suicide is a sin. Again, I think back to one woman in particular where she had some major challenges getting her son buried and eulogized in a particular church because the pastor refused to do so. She'd been a member of this church for her entire life. Her son had as well. He died by suicide. And because of that, the pastor said, all right, I can't eulogize your child because I believe that he's currently in hell. And so I just recall the incredible disappointment and pain in talking with her around this topic. So definitely the issue about suicide being a sin is still alive and well, and it's still an issue that people are certainly dealing with. Also, the Black community has more pressing issues. I mean, in 2020, we could certainly say that, right? But nonetheless, what I found in my research and talking to hundreds of folks over the years is that, well, why are we focusing on suicide when we have mass incarceration, we have poverty, we have issues in the healthcare system, we have health disparities of other kind that are taking more lives? Why are we focusing on that? Prayer as the sole solution for mental illness and suicidal thoughts and behavior. And so this was part of one of the things that came up in my work is, you know, you can pray it away, and that's it. Once you pray, that's it. You don't have to do anything else. And so kind of breaking some of the stigma around therapy and seeking additional resources is definitely work that I'm working on now. Discomfort sharing struggles around suicide and mental illness with clergy or church members. So through my work over the years, I hear this time and time again. I'll go to my church, I'll go to my pastor, I'll go to my church family, I'll go to the women's group for anything under the sun. If I need food, housing, clothes, it doesn't matter. But when it comes to mental health issues and suicide, according to many of the folks I've been talking to over the years, this is kind of the area in which where kind of the line gets drawn. So there's some discomfort with sharing this with the church community. So I'm kind of going to do things a bit similar to what Scott did in the beginning of his presentation. We have the numbers, they're here, you have my slides. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I will at the very least let you know kind of the trends and what's going on and what we can do moving forward. And so in 2018, just over 48,000 people lost their life to suicide. Now, this is all racial groups. These are at the national level. These are the most recent statistics we have access to. There's about an 18-month lag between what we have access to through the Center for Disease Control and what's actually been tallied. So the numbers for 2019, as Scott mentioned, aren't completed quite yet, but these are the most recent ones. So, and then the other thing is non-fatal suicide attempts. In 2018, 1.2 million folks attempted suicide in the United States, to our knowledge. And one thing I want you to pay attention to regarding this number is that on average, for every one death by suicide, there's 25 attempts. So just start thinking about this. If you're interested in looking into this topic for your own faith-based communities, think about, it's important to begin to dissect exactly who you're working with and what they have going on. So the majority of the time, of course, these are attempters that we're actually going to be working with, and not necessarily those that have died by suicide. Although the research is very clear that in many cases, those that die by suicide have attempted in the past. So it's a very, very unique line to walk. Now, when we're talking about Black Americans, there's a couple of points. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there's a couple of points. If you had to walk away with the sense of, okay, who's most at risk in the Black community? I know we hear a lot about it, but who should we specifically really think about? Not to overlook anybody else, but just to give you a sense of what some of the patterns are. So from 1981 to 1994, suicide rates among Black Americans increased by 83%. Between 91 and 2017, suicide attempts increased by 73% among Black adolescents. Suicide is now considered the third leading cause of death among those 15 to 24, second among college students. And also, as of 2015, suicide rates among Black children between the ages of 5 and 12 for the first time in history surpassed white children of their same ages. The other thing to note is that Black Americans typically die by suicide a full decade earlier than whites, and so they tend to be younger. And so the average age of an individual who died by suicide in terms of a Black American is 32, whereas it's 44 for those of white Americans. So those are important to note. But then there are also a few groups that are really, when we think about the suicide statistics and we think about those that actually die by suicide, obviously this is a group that we want to look into doing more prevention intervention work with, right? But nonetheless, there are some overlooked groups that oftentimes, in my opinion, just don't get talked about enough. The first is those that contemplate. And so these are those that self-report thoughts of engaging in suicidal behavior. Keep in mind, this slide is twofold. It's number one, to kind of raise awareness, but number two, so you can become familiar with some of the key concepts around this topic. So again, those that contemplate, these are those that admit that they've had thoughts of engaging in suicidal behavior. And then we have those that attempt. And so these are the individuals that potentially participate in some sort of self-injurious behavior. There's a non-fatal outcome, but there is evidence that the person intended to harm themselves or take their life. And then we have, which I heard Dolores mention in one of the breakout rooms, the suicide survivors. And so here we're talking about family members and significant others who have acquaintances who have experienced the loss of a loved one to suicide. And I wanted to really share this interesting statistics that I think is really important. Research-based estimates suggest that for every death by suicide, 147 people are impacted by that, 147 people. So as we begin to think about prevention, intervention, and post-vention work, which I'll talk more about during the next workshop, we need to think about the fact that we're not just talking about the individual that has dealt with suicidal thoughts or attempts, but we also want to think about their surviving family members that are now left behind to kind of deal with and cope and grieve the loss of their loved one. And so 147 folks are impacted by that, but 6 people are intimately impacted by the death of an individual by suicide. So there we're talking their kids, potentially their spouse, their parents, depending on the nature of that. So continuing on with this conversation of who's most at risk, it appears the trends, my disclaimer for sharing this information is that I don't want you to overlook people that are not within these groups. But nonetheless, there are some patterns and trends to help us begin to think about ways to serve folks in this area. And that's certain age groups. We know that Black teen girls between the ages of 12 and 17 and Black males between 25 and 34 appear to be more at risk than other groups when we think about the subcultures within the Black community. Geographical locations, when we're talking about Black folks, we're talking about folks that reside in the South or Northeast region of the country. That's different for whites, but in this case, we're talking about Blacks. Also, we have social support. These are those that have little to no social support system or network. So here you begin to think about folks that have very challenging relationships with their family or folks that have absolutely no family. Okay, so we see that this appears to be a group that's at risk. We also have abuse victims. This, in much of the research, talks about Black women who have been victims of childhood sexual abuse. My argument to that, though, is that there just hasn't been a lot of research on young Black boys that have been victims of sexual abuse. So we don't want to leave them out either. We just don't have the data to really reflect that quite yet. Also, victims of racism and discrimination. So there's a lot of research that confirms that if you have dealt or you've perceived to have dealt with racial discrimination, be it based on race, sexual orientation, we see a lot of the LGBTQ youth members coming out and talking about struggling with suicide as a result of being discriminated against. This is also another piece of the puzzle where we know that having been exposed to discrimination of any kind and racism does impact your mental health outcomes in a negative way. And then marital status. And so in this case, we're talking about those that are widowed or divorced. So again, the slide is literally just to kind of bring your attention to the plethora of issues or challenges that these individuals or the groups that we're talking about might be facing, but not necessarily to have you overlook. I could obviously talk about veterans in this conversation, those that have some PTSD as a result of serving tours, multiple tours and things of that nature. But this is kind of a summation of a lot of the research on who's most at risk for Black Americans. Okay, so we have a second question. And the second question, polling question, was before today, how aware were you that suicide within the Black community was an issue? Charles, do you have those results? I know you've polled folks already, but do we have the actual results of that?
I went ahead and re-polled it, and so those that didn't get a chance to answer,
Okay.
Yeah, it's popped up there now.
Okay, perfect.
Some people said they couldn't see it because they had to scroll down, so we had to reformat the question.
Gotcha. So before today, how aware were you that suicide is an issue within the Black community? Not at all aware, somewhat aware, or somewhat unaware, I should say, somewhat aware, and very aware. So if you can answer that question, it would be great. So as I wait for you to answer this question, I just really want to drive home the point that when we're thinking about those that are at risk, we want to avoid thinking about this. Oftentimes I hear folks just talking about Black youth. And while absolutely that is a group that we need to be focusing on, it is not the only group in the Black community that is dealing with suicide and suicidal thoughts and attempts. So we want to be mindful of that. So just begin to think about, this a bit more holistically, if I can push you a bit to do so, and know that folks of all age groups really do suffer with suicide and suicidality, or the behavior or the thoughts of suicide. So do we have a summary quite yet?
We have 19 of the 24. We can go ahead and end it, and then.
Yeah, let's go ahead and end it.
All right.
Let's come back if there's time. I want to make sure.
And out of that, 53% was very aware, and 47% was somewhat aware.
Okay. Okay, those are great. I mean, wow, that's way different from when I first started doing this work. So that's exciting to hear. Yes. All right. So moving forward, as of now, I've asked, one of the things I want you to do is think about ways to kind of frame how you, or think about the way you frame suicide, what you bring to the table when you actually encounter an individual in crisis. And if you never do, what do you think about the topic? But then also to be able to identify those that are at risk for suicidal behavior. And so moving forward, I want to really spend a little bit of time thinking about the notion of help seeking as it relates to Black Americans. And so I wanted to first define what help seeking is. I always like to start with the definition so we're all on the same page. And so Rickwood and Thomas, they define help seeking as an adaptive coping process that is the attempt to obtain external assistance to deal with mental health concerns. And some of you may be thinking, what in the world does that mean? So I'm going to just sum it up for you. Essentially, this means, how do I ask for help when it is needed, and what does that look like? And so when we begin to think about help seeking, we have to also kind of break that down. There's two different forms of help seeking. We call it informal and formal. And so formal is when you're going to go to your doctor, your primary care doctor. Formal institutions, your teacher, the resources that are in place, maybe a mental health therapist, counselor, so on and so forth. But there's also an informal form of help seeking. And this is typically when we connect with those that we're most close to, intimately connected to, maybe our spouse, our friends, our family, our loved ones, but not necessarily in the formal sense. And so I'm going to skip the video today because I think that this next slide really does drive home the point. But nonetheless, one of the things that's become incredibly important, and I think COVID-19 and the pandemic has really, as well as the pandemic of racism in this country has really brought to the surface, is that racism literally is a threat to our public health. For the very first time in history, to my knowledge, the American Medical Association acknowledged this last month. And what they've argued is that we literally are going to have to address racism directly within our healthcare system in order to ensure that Black Americans that their health outcomes are no longer negatively impacted by this. So I thought that was really interesting that's finally happened. And so acknowledging that is always the first step. But what we've also found, a lot of social scientists, is that Black folks and folks of other backgrounds, and in this case on this slide, I'll show you, we're talking white folks, they really do experience the world and perceive the world very differently. So if you take a look at some research that was done in 2019 by the Pew Research Center, we see that dealing with the police, we see that Blacks are significantly more likely to say that they were treated less than fairly in comparison to their white counterparts. So 84% said that they were treated less than fairly in comparison to 63% of whites. And then if you take a look at other institutions within our society, if you look at the criminal justice system, something very similar trend here, hiring, pay, promotions, the financial industry when applying for loans, mortgages, in stores, restaurants, voting, and when seeking medical treatment, right? So I think one of the things that this data illustrates is that when we think about help seeking, we also have to think about the experiences, both historical experiences as well as current day experiences in terms of how Black Americans have been treated when they actually do seek formal help, okay? And so what I really want you to begin to think about is, if you're thinking about how you as an individual, how your personal experiences frame the way you see suicide, one of the things that the research is very clear on is that help-seeking behaviors in the United States for Black Americans have been significantly impacted by institutional racism. So what do I mean by this? Black Americans have been found to significantly less likely to utilize mental health services. And when they do so, they're more likely to do so irregularly. Okay, so when we're thinking about formal help seeking, this becomes critically important. Also, Blacks are disproportionately more likely to lack insurance coverage. And when they do go and seek health care from a healthcare physician or a member of the healthcare team, they're more likely to be treated inadequately. And because of that, there's an ongoing mistrust of the healthcare system. So when we think about the ways in which we ask for help and what that looks like, we have to begin to think about some of the rates, the suicide statistics in terms of attempt rates. Are people actually sharing this, right? Because our attempt rates and those who contemplate suicide depend on oftentimes self-reporting. It also depends on who they seek help from, right? So if there's this mistrust, this larger or where there's a chance that there's more mistrust within the healthcare system among Black Americans, this impacts the way folks seek help. Then also, the research is very clear that Blacks are more inclined to seek help from friends and family in lieu of therapy. So I think this is something, as we gear up to do this sort of work, as we begin to brainstorm and think about ways that we can begin to support those within the different categories, whether it's those that are contemplating, attempting, surviving, we have to think about where folks are going to go for help and why. I thought this was an interesting quote. Also, another example from my book. Donna says a lot of African-American women are not willing to openly go to a psychiatrist if they are having problems. Here, this is in the way. She says, we pretty much have the, I guess you can say, the girlfriend connection, or as me and my sisters call it, our gloating box. This is where we have, if we're having problems or if we had a bad day, or if I have something on my mind, I may call my sister and I gloat like, okay, look, this is what's going wrong today. My husband didn't take out the trash, or my children aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And then she says the same goes for me. And once we get off the phone, it's gone. It's like we've moved on. And so when we begin to think about help seeking among African Americans, the one point that I really hope you walk away with is that we are more likely to engage in informal means of support as opposed to formal, which is, I think, very important as we think about prevention, intervention, and postvention work as it relates to mental health and suicide. So why the Black church? And why I think this is important that we're all on the call today. I thought this quote was really incredibly important from Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. And he says that, have you ever thought about the fact that without a psychiatrist, we withstood things that would send most people to insane asylums? We didn't have the benefits of psychiatric counseling at the point of death, but the Black preacher at funeral services became the psychiatrist without a fee. The Black church kept the Black race from committing suicide. So I think what Moss is really getting at here is really kind of the plethora of support historically that the Black church has provided to the Black community in so many different ways. And that historically, and as well as currently, the Black church is certainly still fertile ground for helping us to begin to tackle and unravel the issues around suicide that I believe are going to significantly increase given the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple of statistics that I think are important in terms of why the Black church. Well, one reason in particular is that Black folks self-identify in this country as the most religious group in the entire country, Black men and Black women, right? Because initially people thought, well, is it just Black women? Nope. When you survey Black folks in general, belief in God was significant among Black folks. And this is a national random survey that was conducted a few years back. But not just religion, but also the importance, or not just belief in God, I should say, but also the importance of religion. We see here 75% say that religion is very important, and 16% say it's somewhat important. So if we tally that up, we're up to 91% of folks that in the Black community that really do believe that God in their lives as well as religion is very important, which is yet another reason why the Black church is an incredibly vital place for some of this kind of work. I'm going to wrap up here. The other piece is the Black church is already doing a lot of this stuff. I have to be honest, when I look at, as a scholar, when I look at some of the public health issues that are facing the Black community, what I find is that the Black church really is at the forefront of helping to kind of tackle some of this stuff. We have evidence here of work being done in the Black church promoting heart health and stroke prevention. We see some work here. I know they're small, but it's really just to give you the demonstration that Black churches already have their hand in so many other public health initiatives. And so here we see a church assisting with mammograms and mammography and breast cancer prevention, fighting obesity. There's some work being done there in terms of looking more at healthy eating habits. And then we're also starting to see this kind of trickle into the mental health realm of the counseling profession. We're starting to see the role of Black clergy in the church in terms of mental health services. And then more hopeful, I was even more hopeful with this, we're starting to see suicide prevention programs among African-American youth specifically in the Black church. So in terms of why the Black church is important, number one, the research is very clear that many Blacks go to the church anyway for a host of other issues or a host of other reasons. But then also that the Black church has actually been really leading the charge on a number of other public health initiatives as it relates to improving the health of Black folks in the United States. So the other piece to mention is, and I haven't talked a lot about protective factors, I certainly can if you have questions, but prayer and faith-based beliefs has been identified as a protective factor among Black folks when it comes to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Also, the Black church is a microcosm, right? It's like a miniature society. On any given day, any given Sunday morning, you will have politicians, doctors, lawyers, barbers, beauticians, everybody sitting in the audience, and then going back to their own respective communities, right? So what better of a place to do that? There's been some work recently in the Akron area where barbers have come together with a few researchers, they've gotten grants, and barbers are being trained on how to talk with the men in their chair about mental health issues and mental health concerns. And I thought that was very creative and unique, but obviously a lot of this kind of stemmed initially from work in the Black church. And then lastly, we need targeted destigmatizing efforts. What do I mean by that? I mean that there has been a lot of conversation in the Black church about suicide being a sin and the outcome, the spiritual outcome of taking your own life. But I think the church is also in a very unique position to now begin to kind of engage those sorts of conversations a bit differently. I don't think anybody else can do it but the Black church, because again, there's a lot of history there, and that's where folks are going. They trust them, and that's where a lot of the conversations have started. But just the whole notion that prayer or religion and therapy do not have to be mutually exclusive. Last but not least, there's an upcoming workshop. I know Dr. Dolores will talk to you about that, but when you come back, if you're able to attend the next one, plan on having some more hands-on things where we can begin to work through, develop what prevention, postvention, and intervention means, and how you can begin to think about this in your own respective communities. And then lastly, I just want to mention a dear friend of mine does this every month for free. This is a free QPR suicide prevention training. You have the information, it's here on the slide. You literally just email her to sign up, and it's an hour and a half long, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home. So she has a training coming up on the 19th, but she does this every month. So you can always email her if you can't make that one to attend perhaps in January. So I went over my time because I wanted to let you all discuss a bit more. I apologize to my colleagues, but nonetheless, I'll take questions or whatever you have for me next, Pastor Allen.
All right, yeah. So if you have any questions, you can post those in the chat. And we'll move on, get ready to queue up for Amy here shortly. So if you have any questions, you can post those in the chat, and or if you want to pose your question live, you can do that by just unmuting yourself here shortly. And we have a few minutes here before we can take some of those. Before moving on to Amy.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Spates, I'm curious as to how much does predisposition of mental health issues or suicide ideation, or how much of that predisposition is presented, or how should we present that in reference to mental health challenges that we see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are you saying in terms of when talking with others, just really talking to them about how, if there's some instances in the family where, multiple people have been diagnosed with a mental illness?
Yes, ma'am.
I definitely think it's important. And it all depends on the audience, right? I think it depends on the subpopulation you're engaging. Are you talking about adolescents? Are you talking about adults? Because I think I mean, the research is very clear that mental illness certainly can run in families. It doesn't mean because you have a family member with it that you're automatically going to be diagnosed. But I do think that just thinking about ways to have the conversation and maybe mentioning that might get people to think about, because here's the thing, let's say you grow up in an environment, like I said, I had 2 parents that had mental illnesses. You don't even realize that it's a mental illness until you leave the community or you engage with other people and you're like, okay, maybe something's not right here. So I think just to get them that information might be, very important. Warning signs, symptoms, risk factors, that sort of thing, but not necessarily to focus just on the fact that it's, that you could certainly get it because you don't want to scare them or anything like that. But I definitely think that it's an important conversation to have in the context of the overall talk. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Do I have time to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
So, Dr. Spates, have you ever encountered anyone during your research who is more of the belief that the mental illness is a generational curse, per se?
Yes. Oh man, yes, all the time. Which it can be incredibly complicated. Both I encounter that a lot, and I also encounter that it's a demonic force, right? And so those have been two very challenging, places to start, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And so, yes, I certainly have. And so my goal when I have those sorts of conversations is always to kind of steer it away from the things that we cannot control, right? I mean, let's say hypothetically that was the case. We really have no control over that, but here's some of the things that we can begin to do to work through this issue now. I'll just say this very briefly. When I went over to Kenya to do my research, right? Because when we think about Black folks, we can't be there's a heterogeneous amount of folks in our country. There's not just one type of Black folk, right? We got Caribbean, we got Kenyan, we got all sorts of other folks, ethnically speaking here. But what I learned very quickly is that number one, the notion of suicide was considered that you were possessed, demon possessed. And then the other piece was that it was literally illegal. It was criminal in the country if you attempted suicide, right? So I didn't know that going in, but then when I started talking to folks and they were talking about why they never talk about it, they're like, well, I don't want to go to prison. And I'm like, why would you go to prison? And that's when that came out. So absolutely. And those are really important conversations to have around, what you can do around prevention, postvention, and intervention. So that's a great question, Tanisha. Thank you.
Question: how do you see the school as being a contributing factor to the increase of Black children committing suicide?
Also a great question. I think there is a plethora of pieces to this puzzle, but I certainly wouldn't excuse the school away from the responsibility of that. I definitely think the school is yet another demonstration of silence where we really don't talk about suicide. There's a lot of myths that are circulated around in the school. And I think one of I forget the participant name, but she mentioned that, the myth is that if you bring it up, you're going to get them thinking about it. And then, they're going to ultimately become suicidal. And so I think that that's been a concern for schools, and they just really haven't addressed it. They haven't dealt with it. We have had what's called a suicide cluster. We have had that in the Stark County area, which is the area that I'm in. I think there were maybe 6 suicides as a result of one individual. And then there was another one and another one, and it was very unfortunate, but that's when they brought in folks. I see them as more kind of post, I wish they could be more paired and in terms of prevention, but I tend to see them more reactive in this conversation. So that's how I see their role, and I think they can improve by really beginning to having these conversations with kids because they're already thinking this stuff anyway. The research is so incredibly clear on this. So,
oh wow,
yeah. Hope that
well,
answers.
I look into is statistics and how Black students are 4 to 1.
Yep.
Increased disciplinary actions for same infractions, and how does that mentally impact Black students to see that they're disciplined for or treated a certain way compared to their counterparts?
Yeah, and going back to some of what Scott noted in the very beginning, one of the issues we run into as folks who do this work in the Black community is that the research is so underrepresented. It is still to this day very underrepresented. So we're trying our best to work with what we have, but I mean, myself and a few of my colleagues, we're really trying to change the conversation from suicide deaths to thinking about things more holistically, because there are people that are contemplating every single day. There are people that have attempted multiple times, but they never go to the hospital, so nobody knows this is going on. And then the folks that are also have lost someone to suicide are also really, really struggling. So we have a much bigger task at hand, and just looking at the suicide death rates is that's no longer acceptable, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's unfortunate and surprising that Black children have increased.
Yes.
I mean, just astronomical, and
Sure.
it's unreal. So something has to be done. Mr. Allen.
Yes, well, I'm glad you said that. There's a poll that's screaming right now. Moving forward, how do you see yourself helping with this initiative? So if you guys can please answer that. And if you answer inside of one of those, initiatives, we want to expand this out. Yes, Overseer, we should have more than one option in that. But if you see yourself in that, what I'm going to ask is that if you can shoot myself an email and or Dolores an email stating how you feel yourself helping moving forward with this initiative. I do see sermon outlines and helps with those particular things to bring it up in various congregations, people that can do studies around messaging from a biblical perspective. And so a prevention team, a postvention team, public awareness committee where we can actually design and create messaging so that we can build a great case to Scott to give us some dollars to really put up some billboards and do things of that nature. And then training teams. I think there needs to be trainings developed around this specifically for churches and ministries and mosque, as well as other portions of faith. So and so we wanted to see that. So if everybody can just shoot your answer on there and then shoot us an email where you want to do that. And I'm going to ask Dolores to put her email in the chat box, as well as I'm going to put mine there as well. And then you guys can just email us to let us know how you want to move forward with this. But also, we're going to take one more question. If someone has a question, then we're going to move on to Amy. All right. Amy, I believe you're up.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And while I'm getting ready to share my screen, I just wanted to say hi to Miss Debbie Hill. It was a pleasant surprise to see you this morning. Now let's see if I can figure out how to share my screen here.
She's a superstar. Everybody knows her.
She's had the pleasure or so of working with my husband for many years. So very nice to see you. All right, well, good morning again, everyone. I'm Amy Priest. I'm the Director of Programs and Services at the board. And I am going to talk a little bit about local resources that we have here in Lucas County. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will make sure gets to everyone. So there are some phone numbers or emails that will be on certain slides. You're welcome to write them down if you want to, but I'll also make sure that we get the PowerPoint too as well. And I also have just kind of a one-page resource list that it's kind of an easy resource guide to have sort of at your fingertips. That's much easier than a PowerPoint. So I will make sure to get that to Pastor Allen and make sure that gets emailed out to everyone as well when the presentation is over. So let me see here. Oh, there we go. So in Lucas County, we are very fortunate because we actually are a pretty resource-rich community. We have a lot of resources, of course, never enough like any community, but the key to having all the resources is making sure that the community is aware of the resources, right? So the resources are only as good as people utilizing them. So today I just wanted to go through our local continuum of care, so to speak, on what's available for suicide prevention resources. So we're going to talk about everything from the prevention side of things to the hospital level of care for things. And that's what this slide represents, are all of those resources and then everything in between. The first resource that I wanted to talk about is locally we have a suicide prevention coalition, so Lucas County Suicide Prevention Coalition, and they are, it is members of the community, members of agencies who are connected to the coalition, and they are always looking to add to their coalition as well. So if anyone on the call or on the chat today is interested in joining the coalition, I think they would love to hear from you. So I included their email down there at the bottom. It's just lcsuicideprevention@gmail.com. They are currently meeting monthly. Pre-COVID, I think they were meeting quarterly, but they upped that knowing the need for the work that they're doing in our community. So they're meeting monthly Zoom calls. It's always the first Friday of the month at 1 p.m. You can connect with them through that email. They also have a website that you can connect to as well. You can get on their email list just to get information about what's happening with the coalition, what they're doing, and then to join the coalition if that is something that you're interested in. The coalition has actually been around for about 12 years, I believe, and they are really focused on raising awareness in our community about suicide prevention and then addressing that stigma that Dr. Spates talked about a lot throughout her presentation. They do a lot of trainings, conferences, promoting education. They are in several schools in Lucas County providing resources and education to the schools. So they're doing a lot and also providing some support to survivors of suicide as well. So if that is something that anyone is interested in joining, I think they would be happy to have you. One of the big investments that the board has made with the Suicide Coalition and that they currently provide is the QPR training that Dr. Spates also just recently talked about. So QPR stands for question, persuade, and refer. And if you think about it, you think about it along the lines of CPR. So a person learns CPR through training. CPR is taught so that people recognize the signs of a heart attack or some other sort of physical distress. QPR is the same concept, but connected to suicide prevention or other sorts of mental health crises. So the training is only about an hour long, so it's pretty quick, but it will teach you the warning signs to look for. It will teach you the skills then that you'll need to talk to the person. Dr. Spates talked a lot about asking questions. So there are a lot of myths out there about what to say. If you say too much, if you ask direct questions, you're going to, kind of give them the idea that to complete suicide, but really that's not the case at all. It's actually very important that you're very direct with a person. If you think that they are at risk of hurting themselves, that you're very direct with the questions that you ask and you're very intentional with those questions. So going through the QPR training will teach you those skills. The questions to ask, how to talk to them about reaching out for help, and then where to get help. So question, persuade, and refer. Oops, I'm sorry, I went too far. I wanted to jump back for a minute. With QPR, last month, our board actually approved a pretty lofty allocation for suicide prevention. So we are dedicating about $80,000 of funds towards a community-wide suicide prevention campaign. And those dollars are being dispersed to several different prevention agencies in our county. And then those agencies will then create a community-wide campaign. And each of the agencies have specialized populations that they will be targeting with their campaign. Some of them will be focusing on Black youth. Some of them will be focusing more on teenagers and young adults and students in the schools. Some of them will be doing what's called youth-led prevention activities. So they will actually be getting information and recommendations from youth themselves to help develop the prevention programming that they will create. And then it will be dispersed throughout the community. Another investment at the same time that the board made was what we are calling a QPR coordinator. And that person is going to be working through the Suicide Prevention Coalition. And that person is going to be responsible for recruiting QPR trainers. So not just doing the 1 hour training, but actually being a trainer of that training. And this is where many of you come in here, because we are hoping that the Suicide Coalition will recruit a very diverse group of folks who will then become trainers of QPR and then take that training into their communities. And we want to see good representation in the faith community as well. So if any of you on the call today are interested in becoming a trainer for QPR training, you can reach out to the Suicide Coalition at the email that I provided on the previous slide to talk about next steps for that. So you would become a trainer. This would be of no cost to you. You would become a trainer, and that is something I think that you do more so at your own pace for several hours over the internet. And then there is a financial incentive for all of the trainings that you do moving forward. So our hope is that we have a very diverse group of folks doing these trainings and then taking these trainings into the communities that they work in, that they live in, and that they socialize in, so that it can touch as many people as possible. So this is a really important investment that the board has made in hopes of addressing the increasing rates of suicide that are happening nationwide, including the additional stressors that have been going on just in the last year alone that we've also talked about during Dr. Spates' presentation. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free. You can reach out to me, or you can reach out to the Suicide Coalition directly if you are interested. But this is a really important thing that we wanted to get out there today for everybody. Another training that is available locally is mental health first aid training. It's very similar to QPR training, but it is it's longer, it goes into much more detail, and it's not just focused on suicide prevention, but it also talks about other mental health issues, from depression and anxiety to psychosis. And then the second half of the training actually focuses on substance use disorders, so drug and alcohol usage. Typically, pre-COVID, the training was in person, 8 hours. Since COVID, it has been adapted to a virtual model, and I believe it's like 2 hours of online coursework that you would do at your own pace, and then it's about 5 hours of virtual learning after that. So Robert Kasperzak is our manager of training at the Mental Health Recovery Services Board, and if you are interested in attending a mental health first aid training, you can reach out to Robert at the email there, or you can call his office number at 213-4240. So another very good training, free of charge, and I do believe that we offer CEUs for that training as well. And I also want to note that the QPR training and the mental health first aid training, they are not really designed for clinicians, so to speak. They're actually designed for the lay community, for anyone in the community to complete those trainings, to understand the concepts, and then to gain the skills needed to utilize them in our everyday life as needed. The crisis text line is another tremendous resource in our community. It's actually not just a Lucas County, just a local thing. The crisis text line is actually worldwide, and it is exactly what it says. It is texting with a trained person who can respond back to you via text. So in our day and age, a lot of people utilize texting as their primary way of communicating. And so we, although we are not a funder of the crisis text line, we do actually do a lot of promotion of it, especially for younger folks, the younger generations who rely on their cell phones and texting a lot as their way of communicating. So you can text for hope, but you can actually text anything that you want to 741-741, and 24/7, there's always a trained counselor on the other end who will respond to you. So they will interact with you through texting, they will, what they call, taking you from a warm place to a cool place. So they'll help you know, kind of talk you through, so to speak, whatever is going on, be kind of that listener on the other end. And if it is decided that you need maybe something more intense, another referral, they can help get you connected to other services as well. I wanted to point out that when I was doing some research for the presentation, I looked up the crisis text line website, and when you get on their website, there's actually a lot of information on there. They do a lot of data collection with the folks who are reaching out for support through texting, and you can actually break down some of the data that they've collected by state. So I did that just to see what it would say for the state of Ohio. And on their website, it ranks the US states in order based on the number of contacts that they've had for anxiety and stress related things. So if anxiety and stress was the #1 reason why a person was reaching out, and Ohio actually ranked 25th. So right in the middle of all of the states, Ohio was right in the middle of that. And then you can also filter it out by different topics. And so I played around on that for a little bit, and for anyone reaching out related to suicidal thoughts or ideations, the other co-occurring things that came along with that were relationship problems, depression and anxiety, of course, and then anxiety and stress. So relationship problems were a huge thing, I thought, that cause anxiety and stress that people are reaching out for, looking for help. So very interesting. If you want to learn more, you can access the crisis text line website and kind of play around on there as well. There's also some information about you know, current stressors that we're all facing, including the pandemic, and also stressors related to the election that a lot of people have been experiencing over this last year. So anyways, just wanted to share that. After the pandemic emerged in late winter, early spring, our board made another investment to what is known as the emotional support line, or a warm line. So it was originally created as a result of the pandemic and all of the stressors and anxiety that folks were feeling related to the pandemic. But the pandemic alone is not the only reason why a person can reach out to this number. So neighborhood properties actually man the phones for this number. It's available 7 days a week from 8 a.m. until midnight. All of the calls are confidential. There's no cost to it. There's no billing to it or anything like that. But there's a live person who will answer the call during those hours. It's a trained person with lived experience in mental health or substance use, and they will provide a listening ear. So they will, listen to the reason why you're calling. They'll help provide support. They will help provide resources to you. Whatever it is that you're in need of, they will be on the other end talking you through it. And if it is determined that you need something a little bit more, then they can help you get connected with that as well. So a great resource in our community, anyone can access during their hours of operation, which is 8 a.m. to midnight, but 7 days a week. So a really good number to have on hand. One thing that I've learned over the years with all of the phone numbers that exist as different resources, you never have them when you need them. So it's always a good idea to make a contact in your phone and add these phone numbers into your cell phone, because we almost always take our cell phone with us everywhere we go. So you never know when you're going to need them. So if you plug these numbers into your phone, and then maybe encourage others to do that as well, then maybe they'll be more likely to utilize them when they need it. So that is the emotional support line. And another investment that's fairly new in our community is the Wellness and Recovery Center. Again, operated through neighborhood properties. This is what we call the respite center. So it's only for adults. You have to be 18 or over. You have to have a referral from someone, but it's really meant for those people who are experiencing stress. Maybe their mental health symptoms are starting to increase, but they don't need that hospital level of care. There isn't any medical or real clinical intervention that you're going to receive at the Wellness and Recovery Center. So if you are in need of, let's say, a medication adjustment or to get medication, something along those lines, the Wellness and Recovery Center would not necessarily be the most appropriate place for you. This is more so for somebody who's on the verge of a crisis. They need to maybe get away from the environment that they're in for whatever reason, and just kind of take a break. So it's available. You can stay there for anywhere from up to 1 to 7 days typically. And then while you are there, the staff who work at the Wellness and Recovery Center will work with you on recovery plans, doing other positive relaxation things while you're there, just really focusing on your wellness and your recovery and helping you relearn the coping skills that you have learned in the past and things along those lines. So I did not put a phone number on here, but the Wellness and Recovery Center, like I said, you have to have a referral to get to it, and that is on the neighborhood properties website. So I can get you that information though after the webinar is over today. But a great resource in our community. It's actually located on Glendale Avenue. It used to be the old Glendale Flower Shop, I think is what it was. The name of it was. But if you noticed over the last couple of years, that flower shop was torn down and then they rebuilt this building. So you probably have driven by it many times and maybe not known what it was, but that's what it is, the Wellness and Recovery Center, or also known as the Peer Respite Center. It's very beautiful inside. They've done a great job with all of that. And then we have Rescue Mental Health and Addiction Services. So I'm guessing most people on the call today are familiar with Rescue. They've been our crisis provider in Lucas County for many, many years, and they still are. But they actually do more services other than just the traditional assessment services that I think most of the community is familiar with. Several years ago, we developed what's called the Recovery Helpline, and that number is there. It's a 255-3125 number. That number you can call 24/7 again, and they will actually get you connected with a treatment agency. So this service is more so for a person who is actually looking to get treatment of some sort by a treatment provider in our community. You can call the Recovery Helpline. You can talk to one of their trained clinicians on the phone. They will help you through whatever is the reasoning for your call. And if you do want to get connected to an agency for services, they can actually get you an appointment. Most of those appointments they can get within 48 hours of when you call with a participating agency. So many of the agencies in our community are connected with the recovery helpline. Whether you are looking for mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment, you can call the helpline and like I said, they will connect you and get you an appointment. And then I mentioned the assessments that they do, and those assessments are basically for a person who's seeking hospitalization. Rescue can help get you connected to that level of care if that is what you are in need of. And then another newer service that we have over the last couple of years is what's known as the Mobile Response and Stabilization Services, or affectionately known as MRSS, what we call it at our office. And that is a service meant for youth 0 to 21. And it is where clinicians from Rescue will actually come to the family. So the family defines that there is some sort of need. We say crisis, but I don't want you to think that it has to be like a full-blown psychiatric crisis where there's imminent risk to someone. It does not have to be that at all. It is a family-defined crisis for the youth in the home, and it's the family basically asking for help. They need some sort of support to come out to the home or wherever they're at and provide some sort of intervention. So the family calls Rescue, they state whatever the immediate problem is, and then Rescue will determine if they need to respond as soon as possible, preferably within the hour, or based on what's going on and what the family wants, if they need to follow up the next day. So that is a newer service in our area that, again, is available for youth ages 0 to 21. And then Rescue will provide an intervention in that moment, try to help stabilize the situation, provide support to the family, and then they can actually stay involved for up to 4 to 6 weeks after that, providing ongoing support, as well as then a warm handoff to whatever longer term services the family is in need of to address whatever is going on. And then Rescue has their crisis stabilization units. So those units are the units that are located in Rescue's building. They're voluntary units. So if you think of the continuum of like the Wellness and Recovery Center, which is, you know, more a respite place for a person who's on the verge of a crisis, but not quite there yet. They really just need to get away and take some space. And then you have the crisis stabilization units, which are voluntary units for maybe somebody who's in that same space, but maybe they do need a more medical intervention. So they need a doctor to talk to look at their medications, to you know, evaluate what's happening with them clinically. Then a crisis stabilization unit would be a great opportunity for those services to happen. And then finally, we have our hospital units here in Lucas County. Flower Hospital has a psychiatric unit. St. Charles has their Behavioral Health Institute. And then UTMC also has a kids unit, the Kobecker Center for kids, I believe 12 to 18 or 12 to 17. And then UTMC also has a geriatric unit for patients 55, I believe, maybe 60 and older. So this kind of describes the full continuum of services that we have in Lucas County. Everything from the Suicide Prevention Coalition, where you can join that, you can contribute to the education and awareness and stigma busting that we've talked about in the community, to where a person is maybe in need of more services, or you're trying to help a person who is struggling in some way and you don't really know where to go. You could start with the emotional support line. You could call the recovery helpline. You know, you could utilize any of those phone numbers to call first looking for help, or give the person the crisis text line number where they can reach out to somebody on their own if that's what they want to do. So that is pretty much my presentation. But I'm happy to take questions, and I will make sure that I get that one pager that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation out to everybody. That will include the contact numbers for everything here.
So Amy, I did include in the chat a link to the Neighborhood Properties Incorporated Wellness and Recovery referral packet for everyone.
Okay.
So if you just open up that link, you'll see a form that has the numbers and all the information they would need for those referrals.
Thank you. Go ahead, Scott.
I was just about to throw it over to Dolores. We are kind of getting close on time, and I was going to ask permission from Charles, since I had the mic, just to move it over to Dolores for closing statements and a little bit more about what our future holds.
Okay, not seeing any questions in the chat. I want to thank everybody for participating this morning in our session. Thanks, Amy, Scott, Dr. Spates, your time, your investment. I know Monday mornings are not easy for the faith community. We really appreciate it and hope that we were successful somewhat in raising awareness around suicide in our community. 3 things I want to leave you with. 4, actually. There is another session which will be held January 15th, same time. That's a Friday, January 15th, 10 o'clock to noon. We'll send a link out for you to that registration. Dr. Spates will be back. What I'm most excited about is the opportunity to give Dr. Spates some Lucas County specific feedback to help her develop resources and presentation for us in January. So you will get in an email a link from me to the survey as well as to the registration. If you could complete the registration and the survey, we'll be able to get that information to Dr. Spates in preparation for next month's session. So I hope that you will, 1, register for January, 2, complete the evaluation you get, giving us feedback. Essentially, we want to know about this session, but we also want to know, what do you need? What can we do differently? How can we help you connect? And then, of course, once you register, I really hope you show up for the session on in January. Keep in mind that even if you are an individual or from a community that's still struggling with the issue of whether suicide is a sin and how you can or cannot connect on behalf of an individual who has completed suicide, all the research also tells us that prevention asset building does work. And so if you can't be useful, helpful on the back end to family, please get engaged in crafting messaging and services and programs in our community for the prevention of it. Thanks again for your participation. I look forward to seeing you in January, and you will be getting an email link from me.
Awesome. Thank you all. You all have a great day, and we'll see you in January.
You too. Thanks, Dr. Allen. Appreciate you, bro. Have a great day.
Appreciate you too.
All right.
Hey, great job.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
You too.
Thank you. See you soon.